What are the tools to effectively and efficiently combat criminal risk? Those made up perhaps of organized crime groups or simply criminal gangs, or even in some cases terrorism. One of these tools is certainly the so-called phenomenon of pentitismo, what in Italy is called the justice collaborator. The justice collaborator is basically someone who self-criticizes what he has done in the past. So, is he a criminal or a terrorist who, after having had a bloody career, realizes he was wrong? He tries to make amends. And in that case, he decides to cooperate with the police and the judiciary to shed full light on things, and in return, obtain some leniency. We could call it that as far as his legal position is concerned. The phenomenon of pentitismo, or justice collaborators in Italy, actually began with terrorism. Let's think of Patrizio Pecci, the man who shed light on the Red Brigades from the inside, thanks above all to the persistent work of General Carlo Alberto della Chiesa, who convinced him to abandon the armed struggle for an opportunity for reconciliation, even on a national level. But it wasn't just terrorism, where in any case we saw people repent. Also on the far-right front, let's think about the Nuclei Armati Rivoluzionari, about Giusva Fioravanti's brother. The repentant ones were fundamental in the fight against Cosa Nostra. Don Massino, Buscetta, Totuccio, Contorno, the first and most important ones, were the ones who made the first maxi trials possible. But also in the case of the Banda della Magliana, that complex network of crime, corruption, drug dealing, money laundering, arms trafficking, and much more. That meeting point between the Roman high society, the angry gangs of former robbers and drug dealers, the real estate speculators from the time of the sack of Rome, the rogue secret services, and much more. Consider the Vatican and P2. Here is that network, so complex, that came to light in the 1980s after a long period of working underground, and that perhaps still isn't completely dead today. The Magliana gang was discovered and partially dismantled, thanks to them, to the justice collaborators, to the informants. This is an overview of the main informants of the Magliana gang. The first one, in chronological order, was their Sorcio. Fulvio Lucioli Fulvietto, one of the first members, actually the very first member of the Magliana gang, reciting an inner mea culpa. That is, he speaks, still driven by personal interests, meaning the attempt to avoid serious reprisals against himself. After he was arrested on June 3rd, 1983, in fact, Fulvio Lucioli took a few months to decide to cooperate. He had been part of one of the first groups of those gangs that later merged into the Banda. He had started his career as a train robber and then became an expert in the field of drug trafficking. In 1983, he decides to break the wall of silence, to break the code of silence that persisted within the gang. That code of silence that until that moment, to get away with it, to always get off scot-free, in any situation, even though she was already stained, of the Grazioli kidnapping, just to name one, or the murder of Francino Air, criminal Franco Nicolini, or the feud against the fishmongers. The Proietti were guilty of killing the head of the gang, Giuseppe Pucci. Lucioli is the one who breaks the wall and actually breaks it. With so many statements made to Magistrate Nitto Palma and to the head of the Rome narcotics squad that they led to a huge roundup, the one on December 15, 1983. Many bosses, accomplices, and small-time operators are arrested and end up in jail because Lucioli spilled the beans. But Lucioli's not fully believed. The proof comes in the following years. Why is that if the first trial and the appeal still end with heavy sentences for the various members of the gang? The Supreme Court wipes everything out, especially erasing what was the accusatory framework. The Supreme Court ruled that the Magliana gang's criminal association was not mafia. The trial has to be redone in the Court of Appeal, and this time, too, the Lucioli theory is dismantled. Lucioli is even described as a mythomaniac, a personality affected by psychological delusions that lead him to distort the reality he lives in. In short, Lucioli is considered an unreliable witness, and it's truly ironic when you think about what the Magliana gang was. But Lucioli isn't the only one. A few years later, Claudio Sicilia from Ervesuviano arrives. He's called that because, after all, he's a Neapolitan. Transplanted to Rome, a Neapolitan who brought with him very close ties to the Camorra. He's related to Camorra members, after all. Sicily. He joined the gang thanks to the interest of Marcellone Colafigli, one of the leaders of the Magliana Sicilia faction. Since joining the gang, he has managed drug trafficking, mainly in La Garbatella and Tormerencia. But that's not all. He's a very interesting character. He manages part of the gang's treasury, and above all, he's one of the few who has free access at any time to the gang's secret arsenal, inside the premises of the Ministry of Health on Via List. Strange, isn't it, that a character like that, who should basically be a secondary figure, has all this power. And it's even stranger that, despite Lucioli's revelations, Sicilia remained free for almost another 3 years. He wasn't arrested along with the other leaders of the gang. No, he stayed out of it. He continued to manage drug trafficking on one hand, and on the other, the flow of money that went to the leaders imprisoned in jail. Up to a certain point until 1986, when the split within the gang between its two sides, the Magliana side and the Testaccio side, became irreparable. Claudio Sicilia himself was the target of an assassination attempt. It was never clear if the Magliana group or the Testaccio group was behind it, since he worked and spoke with both. Not only that, from that moment on, Claudio Sicilia decided to stop handing out the famous weekly bribe, both to the inmates and to their families, becoming an enemy of the gang. Arrested also in '86, he too decided to take advantage of the law for informants. The law, enacted in 1980 and later updated, first with the intervention of Judge Falcone and then again in 2001, well, the revelations of Claudio Sicilia confirmed the theories of Fulvio Lucioli, the theories of Sorsio, even if perhaps a little late. Not only does Claudio Sicilia broaden the perspective, he doesn't just talk about drug dealing, usury, money laundering, or murders. No, he also talks about the gang's relationships with external parties, for example, with the Camorra, with Cutolo's Nuova Camorra Organizzata, with Zazza, with the Nuvoletta clan. He discusses the gang's ties to neo-fascist extremism and the Nuclei Armati Rivoluzionari, which includes Nero, among others. Massimo Carminati talks about the gang's dangerous relationships with Pippo Calò, the treasurer of Cosa Nostra, who lives right in Rome in hiding, and who is among those who ordered the Rapido 904 massacre, the massacre on the eve of Christmas Eve in 1984. We already talked about it in another video. Claudio Sicilia's revelations also trigger another wave of arrests and new investigations, but he too is not considered completely reliable. Proof of this is that a few years later, Claudio Sicilia is released, but without a protection program for his benefit, almost considering him a minor figure, if not expendable, at least not in danger of his life. And that's a mistake because the gang doesn't forget when Claudio Sicilia became a traitor. Therefore, he must pay and will be killed on November the 18th, 1991. By two hitmen in Tormerencia. It's clearly not over yet. There are other prominent figures. Among the various informants, for example, there's Vittorio Carnovale, E.D.R. Cornelio, brother of Giuseppe Ertronco, who died in 1990 of natural causes. Carnovale is also a rather peculiar character because he's part of the Acilia group, one of the 3 original groups of the gang. He was arrested in connection with the revelations made by Sorsio, by Fulvio Lucioli, and in 1986, exactly on May 26th, he incredibly managed to escape from the bunker courtroom of the Rome tribunal, an escape that caused a sensation. It was a real scandal. How was it possible that in a courtroom and in the corridors leading to the cells, crowded with people and with many carabinieri, a criminal could manage to escape? Discovered years later, it was part of a plan originally devised by Renatino de Pedis to help Eduardo Toscano escape, but Toscano was afraid for his own life. De Pedis himself had sent him a message. He told the little worker that maybe, once he got out of prison, he wouldn't get very far and someone would silence him forever. So in the end, it was Erconilio who took advantage of the plan, letting them put the handcuffs on his wrists without locking them, so he could then hide behind a staircase. He returned to the detention room and was freed by two people who were never identified, a man and a woman who led him to the exit of the courthouse, right in front of the somewhat suspicious eyes of the carabinieri, who in the end were unable to act. Finally, we reached a Renault 5, and after clarifying the misunderstanding, it was Vittorio Carnovale, not Eduardo Toscano, the little worker. The same Carnovale was taken back to his sister Carnovale's house, and then he was arrested again much later in 1993, when the second wave of arrests against the Banda della Magliana began. From then on, Carnovale decided to confess and clear his conscience. He would still get 10 years in prison. Then, while in prison, he developed his own reinterpretation of himself to the point of becoming a creative writer and a poet. Today, Vittorio Carnovale has paid his debt to justice and has made some very important statements, which, however, in some cases were not useful. This is the case of the murder of Mino Pecorelli. That murder in which for a long time there was talk of the involvement of the Magliana. How? Through the actions of Ceccato Massimo Carminati, that criminal terrorist who moves back and forth between Ur and the fascists of the Nuclei Armati Rivoluzionari, and the Magliana, il Testaccio, the bar that is the symbol of the meeting place for the leaders of the Magliana, and that moves between two worlds. According to Carnovale's statements, was it Carminati who shot the troublesome journalist, together with Angiolino, Biondo, Michelangelo, La Barbera, a Cosa Nostra hitman, all to favor the interests of Giulio Andreotti through Vitelloni? The problem is that Vittorio Carnovale, although he never denies the statements he made during the investigation, does not repeat these words in court. He's afraid. Erconiglio does not go to the courtrooms in Perugia, where the trial of Giulio Andreotti for the murder of Mino Pecorelli is being held. And maybe for this reason too, in the end, all the defendants will be acquitted, maybe because a piece was missing from the puzzle. But there are still other informants to deal with. There's Fabiola Moretti, who will later say she regrets becoming an informant, the woman initially of Danilo. We recently discussed Abruciati at Calamari Leonte and also Antonio Mancini in a previous video. The beggar Fabiola Moretti, a drug dealer and user, has a daughter with Mancini, a daughter who will also become a drug dealer. And Moretti herself over the years will be arrested several times, always for this old habit that seems to never go away. Much more interesting is the figure of her ex-partner Antonio Mancini, the beggar, called that partly because of his physique, his gaunt face, but also because of his cultural interests. He reads a lot, watches many movies, has a great passion for Pasolini's prose, and he's called that after the title of a very famous film by Pasolini. He himself, in fact, seems like one of the street kids that Pasolini writes about and who are depicted in his films. Mancini, among other things, spent more time in prison than on the street, at least in the first years of his life. He did a bit of a tour of Italian prisons, and it was precisely in prison at Regina Coeli that he met that group, the one from Ostia Cilia, the one revolving around the figure of Nicolino Celis, Nicole Sardo, who would become one of the founding souls of the Magliana. When Antonio Mancini is released from prison in 1979, he becomes one of the gang's enforcers and collectors, someone you could trust. The debtors, a bit rebellious, or those people who tend not to understand the importance of the gang in the Roman scene. Even more, because Mancini forms a strong friendship with Chameleon, with Danilo Abbracciati. He accompanies him, he often goes with him to Milan, every time Abbracciati goes to visit. We've already discussed this with Francis Turritello and Ugo Bossi, the leaders of one Milanese underworld faction. And when Abbracciati dies, he dies, as we've already seen, because he was killed by a night watchman after an attempted assassination of Roberto Rossoni, vice president of Banco Ambrosiano. Mancini is in prison. And he's in prison because some time before he tried to take revenge. Not alone, but with Marcellone and Colonel De Figli for the murder of Franco Giuseppucci, known as the Negro and the Fornaretto, who founded the gang and was killed by the rival Proietti clan, the Pesciaroli, who supported Francino EER, a top criminal in the betting halls and racetracks of the capital. When shots are fired on Via di Non Olimpia, and they're fired to kill, on March 16, 1981, something goes wrong, because both Colfigli and Mancini are wounded. They also try to hide behind the kidnapping of one of the Proietti sons to make their way and avoid being caught by the police or lynched by other members of the Proietti clan. In the end, both of them will be captured, and Mancini will begin a long series of imprisonments, releases, and new arrests. When Vittorio Carnovale and EER Canelio escape, Mancini refuses the chance to escape as well. He only has a few months left to get a special permit after 6 years in prison. So he stays in prison, gets out, is caught again, and brought back in. Mancini becomes a pentito in 1994, a particular period when the precise picture of the Banda Magliana as a network begins to take shape. Active on many fronts, on the front of the Pecorelli case, but also regarding the relationships with the intelligence services, especially the rogue ones, the super schemes of Pazienza, General Santovito, Musumeci, Belmonte, Manucci, Bennett Home, all characters who revolve around Fortebracci, the Servizio per l'Informazione e la Sicurezza Militare headquarters, and the relationships with these strange criminals, those from the Magliana. But not only Mancini talks, he talks freely. He talks about the Moro kidnapping, about when the Christian Democrats even worked with common criminals. Even with those from the Magliana, they had only recently begun working together to find where the Honorable Aldo Moro was held. Or he talks about the figure of Renatino de Pedis, the leader of the Testaccini, who died in 1990, not far from Campo dei Fiori, in yet another feud ordered by Marcellone and Colafigli through the intervention of two Tuscan hitmen. Renatino de Pedis, who was buried in the church of San Apollinare. It's said to be due to a favor exchange with Cardinal Poletti, and the burial of Renatino de Pedis is also a mystery, which relates to another major mystery, Emanuela Orlandi's sudden disappearance. We've already talked about this too. These are all mysteries that Mancini sheds some light on, because he doesn't know or can't talk about everything. But when Mancini speaks, he never does so randomly. Also because he goes on to confirm the revelations of what we could call the biggest informant of the gang. From Magliana, Maurizio Abbatino, known as Crispino, perhaps the founding member of the Magliana, together with Franco Giuseppucci, starting from their chance meeting when Giuseppucci went to Abbatino to complain. A bag of weapons that was in his custody and had been stolen from him along with a car. Crispino was involved directly or indirectly in almost all the violent events of the Magliana, the Grazioli kidnapping, the Caso Moro case, the killing of Francino, the revenge against the Pesciaroli. Crispino's hand is always involved, and Crispino's hand is also behind many other deaths. That of Nicolino Solis, who started getting cocky and, after getting out of prison, began demanding too much. Not just Di Gianni Gerlando from Torosio, who also has some unresolved issues within the Magliana. And Crispino's hand is behind many other crimes. He himself at a certain point will say that he never counted them. Maybe he wouldn't even be able to count the dead he left behind on the street. But he remembers every name and face of those he shot. Crispino Abbatino inspired the cold-blooded character in Di Cataldo's crime novel. Later adapted for film and television, he is a particularly determined man, determined to the point that he doesn't let himself be intimidated even by the feud. Emerging within the Banda Magliana in the mid-1980s when the war between His faction, the Maglianas, and the Testaccini faction of De Pedis started leaving bodies in the streets. At that time, Abbatino's in prison, but he doesn't want to stay behind bars. In fact, he starts pretending to be sick. He injects blood from an inmate with lymph node disease into himself. Then what does he do? He pretends to have bone cancer, a bone cancer so advanced that it prevents him from using his legs. So he sits in a wheelchair and doesn't move a muscle for several months. He arranges a transfer to a private facility in the EUR district to continue his detention. After all, the falsified medical records describe a terminally ill patient, a prisoner who could pass away in a few months or maybe even a few weeks. One night on December 20, 1986, Crispino manages to escape from the clinic with his brother Roberto's help, fleeing to Switzerland. From there to Rio de Janeiro, then Caracas, Venezuela, where the criminal pole finds him again. In the meantime, the gang, who fear Crispino because they worry he might cooperate with the authorities, since Crispino knows too much, they kidnap and torture to death with a final stab to the chest his brother Roberto, who will be found dead. Maybe this is also what pushes Crispino, after his arrest in 1993, to return to Italy and cooperate with the authorities. His statements confirm Lucioli and Cecilia's theories, which had not been fully believed. They lead to other trials, more arrests, and the discovery of another underworld beneath the Magliana. There is talk again about the Moro case, about Andreotti, about the Pecorelli murder. These are the same statements that Antonio Mancini agrees with a year later. But Crispino still has a significant debt to pay to justice, a debt that eventually comes due. It comes up every time he, even under escort, is taken to the various institutions in Pera. Every time he knows he might end up in the same facility as some of his former associates, like Carminati or Paradisi, Crispino rebels and gets a transfer. Once his escort frightened off would-be killers, possibly sent by the Testaccini, to silence that old boss who was a bit too talkative once and for all. In 2015, however, Maurizio Abbatino lost all his protections. His escort was withdrawn, and the fake identity that had covered him was taken away. In 2017, his disability pension was even revoked because it can't be granted for mafia-related reasons. In 2022, Maurizio Abbatino is under house arrest due to illness, but must still serve a 30-year prison sentence. But after all this, one wonders, was Claudio Sicilia's sacrifice enough? Were the revelations of the so-called fantasist Lucioli enough? Was what Catone said enough, what Crispino revealed? Cornelio's confirmations during the investigation clarified the t-shirt issue. Maybe not, because when the Mafia Capitale scandal breaks out, when it's discovered that crime in Rome never really went away, when you see some old member of the Banda della Magliana end up on the morgue table with bullets in his body, like Paolo Frau, killed in 2002. When Massimo Carminati returns to the spotlight and is released, you realize the Banda is still alive. And that's what Antonio Mancini has said several times, who is now free and, to complete his social redemption, works with social cooperatives. What Mancini said is that the Banda is still alive. It never left. It never died. It was never rooted out of Rome. The Banda is there. Maybe some men have changed. Maybe those who died or ended up behind bars have been replaced by some other former colleague or former subordinate. Maybe the killers from back then, those who used to act under someone's orders, have now become bosses, or they've formed new alliances. Pipocolo is gone. The organized Camorra has disappeared, but other criminal groups remain. There's the Casamanica clan, which at one point tried to take over Rome, just like in the dreams of Franco Giuseppucci. Whether they're criminals of Roma origin, whether they're the mafiosi of Cosa Nostra, or men who came up from the Neapolitan outskirts of the Camorra, it doesn't matter. Rome, it said that it doesn't accept masters. It said that Rome, after the 7 kings, didn't want any more, and that in the end, almost all the emperors met a bad end. Franco Giuseppucci's dream was to take Rome, to become the king of Rome, to dominate Rome, even if it meant making alliances. In fact, alliances that were increasingly risky, increasingly dangerous. Giuseppucci's lesson was well learned by his heirs. And so yes, Antonio Mancini, the beggar, one of the major informants, is right. The Magliana gang today is not defeated. It hasn't disappeared. It isn't dead. The Magliana gang, unfortunately, is still alive.